Good morning, everybody. Hi, welcome to the latest Awmsg Open Day. So my name is Stephen Lister, and known to some of you, I think I'm a health economist at BMS, and I'll be chairing today. So the purpose of today is to give you an overview of the appraisal process within Awmsg. That is hosted by our friends at AWTTC, which is the Secretariat for Awmsg, for those of you who are not so familiar. We'll be covering a few things, a brief overview of what the appraisal process looks like within Wales, a set of hints and tips to help you make the best of your submission, and then a couple of process updates on what's changed recently. And this is all about making great, in fact, transformational medicines available to patients across NHS Wales. But without further ado, you don't want to hear much from me on that. I can hand over to Steph, who's going to give an overview of HTA across Wales. Hold on to your seats. Just to let you know, there's a chat and questions function in the app. If you want to ask questions, feel free, jump in anytime. We'll monitor the questions and come back to you. Rather than leave all the questions to the end, we'll try and address these at a time that's a bit more appropriate. So let's hold on to your seats. Over to you, Steph.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, morning everyone, and thanks for attending today. For those of you who were with us last time, we're also going to try and run another Slido poll, or two in fact, so if you've got another device at the ready, that would be handy. As Steve's already mentioned, I'm going to say a few words about the overall appraisal process and then hand over to Stuart, keeping scientist at AWTTC, to talk about the more detailed submission process. So I'm just going to start with my next slide, which just highlights some of the terminology that I might refer to. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this, but those who are new to the Awmsg appraisal process, I'll just go over these things quickly. So the Form A is the initial appraisal submission, and this is the form we request ahead of license and is our means of opening up communication links as early as possible. And we asked for this historically around the time of CHIMP opinion, but moving forward, we're still going to look to be requesting this 2 to 3 months ahead of license. And it's up to the company to submit this, and ideally they should be proactive with this so that we've got all the information we need. So Form B, that's a full appraisal submission, and that's the form we request if your medicine meets the criteria for a full analysis of the clinical and cost effectiveness, to take it through the Awmsg appraisal process. Form C is a limited version of the appraisal, and this is a streamlined form where we can look at the clinical effectiveness and the budget impact, but where we don't require cost effectiveness models or information, and that enables us to make a decision for a number of medicines that meet the criteria for that limited process. So I may refer to the commercial arrangements and the Wales patient access schemes, and these are dealt with by another team within AWTTC who spoke last time. It's important we know about these ahead of your submission, so that we can look to see whether we need to process these, and so that it doesn't cause any delays with the appraisal process as and when we receive your Form B or Form C. I may also mention a statement of advice, and again this was touched upon at the last session, and these are advice or a statement that's put on our website when we don't have a submission from a company, and the purpose is really just to inform the service that there is no advice and that medicine shouldn't be used in NHS Wales. So moving on to my first slide. So this made an appearance, a very similar slide at the last open day, and the purpose of this slide is just to highlight some key engagement points and how they align to the regulatory timelines of a medicine, and where we expect for us to engage with you and you to engage with us. So early on, well, early on in the regulatory process, about the time when the phase 3 trials are finalising, AWTTC have a small horizon scanning team which will look to see which medicines are coming through, with the ideal to identify medicines which have a high budget impact or are likely to cause a high service impact. And these we keep on our database, and we monitor this information. Primarily we use UK Pharmascan, but we also have other databases we will check. So moving on from this, so before a medicine is licensed and around the time of CHIMP opinion, we will actively go out to a company and request Form A. And I'm seeing more now that companies are being proactive and sending us their Form A's ahead of marketing authorization. And this is really good for purposes I'll probably speak about in the next slide. So not only at that time do we get a feel for what's coming, it also enables us to work out which medicines we can take through the Awmsg appraisal process and which medicines have commercial arrangements that we need to pay attention to and get our commercial access team involved with. So having received a Form A, we will then expect Form B or Form C once we've requested that around the time of market authorization. And the purpose of this is to enable us to issue advice through Awmsg as close to license as possible, so there's no delay in making medicines available for patients in Wales. So moving on to my next slide. So I've mentioned Form A, and I just want to say a few more words about the purpose and why we ask for it ahead of license. I've already mentioned that we will request this on receipt of CHIMP positive opinion, and I'm aware now with the changes coming out of the Brexit that not all medicines will go through the EMA, and that the MHRA will take on some medicines, and therefore there won't always be a CHIMP positive opinion. At the moment, we're having issues working out how we can monitor this through the MHRA website. So at the moment, I am still looking at CHIMP positive opinions and then relying on the company to keep us informed should the position be different for the United Kingdom. So then once we've received Form A, a pharmacist and the medical director will look at this form and decide whether it meets the criteria for appraisal. In doing that, we have a number of forms that you can view on our website, and I'll refer to these in the next few slides. But the purpose of that is to then either request a full submission, request a limited submission, or exclude the medicines due to it fulfilling one of the exclusion criteria. So the form also has a multi-purpose. So the primary purpose is to decide whether to take the medicines through the Awmsg appraisal process, but it also enables us to gather a bit more information should it not be available. Some companies aren't as active on Pharmascan, so we do rely on some of that horizon scanning information to help us look at which medicines are likely to be of high impact. It also alerts us to whether a medicine is likely to have a WPAS or equally have a PAS, and so we can look to see whether we need to engage with our commercial access team and get those things up and running for Wales. And of course, it also enables us to communicate with you about your plans for taking a medicine through NICE, and therefore working out whether it's going to be important for Awmsg to look at, or whether we need to keep looking at the NICE timelines. So if I show you the next slide, I just wanted to highlight a couple of forms on our website which enable us to determine whether a medicine meets the criteria for a full submission of Form B, a limited submission of Form C, and a new meets the criteria for the new pediatric license process, which you may hear a few words about later, but also hopefully in the next session we'll talk more about this. or indeed whether the medicine meets one of the exclusion criteria and therefore will be displayed on our website as not fulfilling the criteria for appraisal. So my next slide shows a snapshot of the exclusion criteria, and at the bottom there's a link, so really that's there just as a resource if you want to refer back and access that document. I appreciate some of it's truncated here, but there's 17 exclusion criteria. Should anyone have any questions about those when they're filling in their Form A, then just feel free to contact AWTTC if you can't retrieve that information from our website. So again, that's just to highlight where you can find that document. And then the next slide, I won't go into this in too many detail, and apologies, it's very small, but again, this flow diagram is available on our website under all appraisal documents that you can access through the Make a Submission page under pharmaceutical industry. And this really, if you're interested in the detail, it really shows you how we arrive at our decision as to whether it meets a full limited or meets the process for a paediatric license extension. It's something to bear in mind, but it's something that the pharmacist reviewing your Form A and the medical director will use to determine what letter we then send to you regarding where your medicine fits within the Awmsg appraisal process. So just to give my voice a break, the next exercise is really just a little a quiz to see if you can get a feel for the sorts of decisions we make when we receive your Form A. And there's a few questions, and essentially you need to select whether you think that medicine will be appropriate for a limited submission, a full submission, whether it would be excluded or meet the process for a paediatric license extension. So if you could attempt to log on to Slido using the QR code or the website and the number, and we'll see if this works. We did quite well last time, so there's only a few questions. If those who can't access it can just bear with us, and then we can continue. Okay, so assume those that can or are able to are now logged on. We move to the first question. So, well, these are that was just testing us. I think so Velofascium is licensed for improved cycling. Can you tell me which of these options it would fit? The product comprises of 2 medicines which were originally licensed individually for improved cycling in 2008 and 2009. Okay, just moving my pane so I can see how many people are participating. Give you a few more seconds, see if there's any more numbers. Okay, I'll assume there's about 20 of us interacting with this one. So some mixed numbers there. The correct answer in this case would be excluded, and the reason for that is that it's a combination product of medicines already licensed, and they were licensed prior to 2010, and that, I can't remember the number of the exclusion criteria, but that's quite explicitly written in the exclusion criteria. So if a combination product is made up of medicines previously licensed prior to 2010, then that is likely to be excluded from the appraisal process, and that will be displayed on our website. Okay, next question. I think it's coming. Right. So fun making up these names, but you could argue I should have done it so I can pronounce them. Okay, trampoline user, licensed for improved bouncing from age 6 years, was originally recommended by Awmsg for adults and children aged 12 years and upwards. Okay, I think we're nearly there with those contributing. A few more logged on. Okay, so yes, that would meet the pediatric process, and the reason for that is because there's already advice. If there's already an Awmsg and NICE advice for the same indication in different age group, then that would fall within the pediatric process. Should there be any differences in the license, which there's a couple coming through that are proving a bit difficulty, then we may need to consider it for a limited or a full submission. Historically, before the pediatric process was approved, the end of last year, then that would have fallen as a limited submission. Okay, number 3. Right, fast boater bag, license for improved sailing in adults, was recommended for use for improved rowing in adults in 2019. Okay, I think that's everyone. So this would be a full submission, and the understanding that they're 2 distinct indications. One would argue they're both on Wharton potentially, so that they're minor, but no, in my little head, this was 2 distinct indications, so it would meet the requirement for a full submission, and in that sense, that one was quite straightforward. There are instances when an indication may be for the same condition, but we'd need to seek clinical input to work out whether the population was significantly different to determine whether it was a minor license extension or a new indication. But this to me was a new indication as a different sport. Okay, number 4. Okay, speedy legism, a subcutaneous injection for long distance running improvement in adults. And the IV version was licensed for the same indication in 2018. Would you expect it to be limited, full, excluded, or pediatric? Or meet the process for pediatric license extension? Okay. Right. Yeah, thank you. So this was my trick question. I keep throwing in trick questions. So indeed, there's not quite enough information to determine whether it be a limited, a full, or excluded. Most formulation changes, well, not most, all formulation changes where there's no no change in cost will be excluded. If there's a change in cost, but that's not deemed significant, or that there's not a major change to practice or impact, then that could be a limited. However, on very rare occasion, that there may be a significant change in cost, then we would need to do a full submission to look at the cost effectiveness. So again, there's a number of scenarios which would need to be considered to determine which of those it fits into. Okay, I think we're on to the last. Oh no, keep going. Number 5. Tritastic was licensed for improved point scoring in rugby. Was licensed in 2021, and the NICE TA is currently in progress and is expected to be published in February 22. Are we likely to request a limited submission for this, a full submission, exclude, or say it meets the paediatric process? Okay, yeah, we will exclude all medicines where NICE advice is currently expected. We've recently updated our exclusion criteria so that to remove the 12 months, so that Helen will touch on this later, so that if NICE for medicines on the NICE work programme, then AWTTC will be able to exclude that medicine from the appraisal process to avoid duplication of work. There are cases where the steering committee may step in should there be deemed a significant clinical need for a medicine, and where NICE is likely to be delayed, then that would probably be the only instance when we would reach out to you to see if you were able to provide us with a submission ahead of NICE, so that we can enable access within Wales should there be a significant delay with NICE. Okay. Number 6. So faster feet is licensed for quick skipping on the pavement. It was originally licensed for quick skipping on the drive in 2020. Do you expect this to be a limited submission, a full submission, excluded, or meet the criteria for the paediatric process? Okay, equal split on that one. Well, I've got it down as a limited submission on the basis that it's a minor license extension. So my clinical knowledge on skipping would suggest that skipping on the pavement isn't much difference to skipping on the drive. So like I mentioned before, if there was any uncertainty over the clinical picture, we'd reach out to clinical experts to determine whether the population was significantly different, and therefore whether it's deemed a minor license extension. Okay, I think we're on the last one. Okay, Monab, license for amazing all-round performance. It's a new licensed medicine expected to be launched in December 2022. Would we request a limited submission, a full submission, exclude the medicine, or would it meet the process for the pediatric license extension? Okay. I'm sure many of you have had correspondence from us in the past that would request a full submission regardless of launch, and that's the idea is to avoid any delay in making that medicine accessible for patients in Wales as and when that medicine becomes launched. So yeah, that's full submission. Okay, thank you for interacting with that one. The purpose was just to really highlight why we asked for a Form A and what sort of factors we take into consideration, and sometimes why we may take a little bit of time getting back to you if we need to seek clinical input. Yeah, our process says on receipt of Form A, we have 2 weeks to respond and let you know whether that medicine is excluded or meets the criteria for a full or limited submission. Okay, I've got a couple more slides. So I've spoken about Form A. I'm going to just briefly speak about the Form B and the timelines for us requesting a Form B, and also the timelines for an appraisal. And I think the next couple of slides are just resource points for where you can find the information on our website. So we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so all the information is on our website about why we want a Form A, how you can submit one, and where you get the information from. So there's a link on this slide to the Make a Submission page, and there you'll find a drop down to Form A, the pediatric extension process, Form B and Form C. And at each of those points on the right hand side, you'll be able to find the documentation that relates to submitting those forms. So really the purpose of this slide was just to highlight where that information sits on our website and then show you the sort of information that's there. So that's the information about Form A. If I move to the next slide, it's quite lengthy, but should anyone wish to find out a bit more about what we've been talking about today, if you go to the Form B drop down, you can find out why, when and how we ask for that. And as I said, there's a list of forms that are of interest should you be new to submitting a Form B. And then the next slide is a long list of all our appraisal documents. Should you know what you need, then you can go straight to this page under Make a Submission, and it's a link to all appraisal documents, and there's everything from the submission forms, the guidance notes, the FAQs, and some of the flow diagrams that I'm showing you today. So if I move to my next slide, so I'm going to speak about the appraisal process timelines now. So after Form A, once we've received your Form B or Form C, and some of the terminology we use there, and apologies if the majority of you are familiar, but it does get quite confusing when you're not, is the ASAR, which is the Awmsg Secretariat Assessment Report. And that's the report that we prepare at AWTTC to summarise the evidence submitted in your Form B or Form C, and it provides not only a summary of the clinical and cost effectiveness evidence, but also a critique on some of that evidence provided, and should link with the clinical picture for Wales. And then that ASAR, when that gets sent to you, when the report gets sent to you, you then are able to respond, and we call that the company response to the ASAR, the CR ASAR. And you'd have 14 days to respond to the ASAR we provide you with, and the document that you then send back to us is the CR ASAR. The PAR is the preliminary appraisal recommendation, and that's produced from the evidence committee, the New Medicines Group, or NMG, and that's sent to you after that meeting has convened, and gives you the recommendation that's made by that committee. The FAR is the final appraisal recommendation, and that comes from Awmsg after the public meeting. And where I refer to WG, that stands for Welsh Government. So on to my next slide. So this was my own version of a more detailed flow diagram that is available on the website, and that should give you the information you need if you want a bit more of the detail. But I'm just going to whiz through it so you've got a feel for the different stages in the appraisal process. So on receipt of Form B or Form C, AWTTC have 2 weeks to look at that form and to get back to you should we have any queries. Once we're happy with what we've got and we've reviewed your evidence, we will then send you a scoping letter which confirms the scope of the appraisal, and we expect you to accept that scope as form of acknowledgement that we can proceed. Now in that letter, we will be able to schedule the timelines of your appraisal once you've received Form B, and is the point of that letter that we're able to tell you when you should expect the ASAR, the report, and when you should expect NMG and Awmsg. So we then take about 6 to 8 weeks to prepare the ASAR, and that it takes that long because we have quite a team of people to involved, from the health economic team to the clinical team, and each team has an author, an editor, and then the final proof. And we do involve clinical experts in terms of if we've got any questions for them, we will ask them at that point, and then that helps inform the ASAR. We also ask patient organisation for their views, so that can go to the first committee with all the evidence and the ASAR. So once the ASAR is prepared, we then send that to yourselves, and you have 2 weeks or 10 working days to respond to those comments or comments we've put in the CR ASAR, but also you have the opportunity then to respond to anything in the ASAR that is factually incorrect, or things that we may have written that you wish to query or seek clarity over. So you will then send that CR ASAR back to us, and we then prepare the documents for the evidence group, the New Medicines Group, and that will include the ASAR, the CR ASAR, the clinical expert views, the patient views. They also have sight of the Form B, and so with all that information, we're able to go to the New Medicines Group, and they're able to discuss the clinical and cost effectiveness of the medicine, and make and vote for a recommendation, and that's done in private, so everyone has their own vote, and then those are counted, and we inform you of the outcome. So when we send you the preliminary appraisal recommendation, you then have 7 days to respond to that. We then gather all the evidence for the All Wales Medicine Strategy Group. That's a public meeting. Unless there's a commercial access arrangement, then that will be done in private. Now, that committee get the preliminary appraisal recommendation, and the NMG chair, as well as the AWTTC lead for that medicine, will present the views from the New Medicines Group. So really, Awmsg do consider the discussion that's been had at NMG, but they are really there to consider the budget impact and the wider societal views of that committee. So it's important that when a company attends Awmsg, they have the right people there to answer the questions, with the mind that the New Medicines Group do not consider budget impact or wider societal issues. Awmsg are also given the views of the clinical expert, but they don't receive the Form B, so they don't have all the detail that we provide that in the summary in the ASAR. So once Awmsg have made their recommendation, that's the final appraisal recommendation, which is sent to yourselves and then forwarded to the Welsh Government for ratification. As the point of ratification is when, if a medicine is recommended, the health boards then have 60 days, as they do with a nice fad, to make that medicine available for patients in Wales. And so that really is a whistle-stop tour of the process. And I don't want to go into too much more detail, because I know Stuart will touch on some of the detail or the steps within that process, but feel free to use the question function to ask me if you have any other questions. I think I'll just finish on my last slide, which, as I mentioned before, that essentially is the detailed version that sits on our website, and the links provided there of the different steps in the process. And should anyone have any questions about any of those stages, then feel free to email us. And I think that's all I need to say at this stage, and I'm sick of hearing my voice, so I'm going to hand on over to Stuart to talk about building a good submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph.
Stuart, before you kick in, just thank you. That's a really helpful overview. And for those of you who are slightly bewildered by the complexity, the language, the terminology, the Form A, Form B, Form C, exclusions, and the rest, the AWTTC team are here to help you through. And the whole purpose of the Form A is to help you decide, help to work out what it is that you need, the process you need to follow. So hang in there. Don't forget the end game here. You know, patients across Wales are waiting for your medicine. And so it's in their interests to make sure that your medicine gets a fair appraisal by Awmsg. So without further ado, questions in the chat. As always, over to you, Stuart. How do we build a good submission?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, good morning, everyone. So hints and tips on building a good submission. Next slide, please. Okay, so to stop everyone getting overwhelmed by paperwork, we need to think about which studies to include and exclude. So preferably the studies that we're after are going to be the randomized control trials. They're going to be phase 3 type trials where we've got large groups of patients and against an appropriate comparator. Now, in some cases, there may be opportunities for using real-world data. Tends to be the exception, but if that makes sense for you, perhaps because there's not a lot of evidence for the medicine, perhaps it's in a rare condition, then please justify your decision to include that type of data. So the endpoint should be relevant to the medicine and patient-centered. We're not particularly interested in dose-finding studies where you're perhaps exploring the dose prior to the establishing what the licensed dose should be. And phase 2 studies tend to be less important, particularly if you've got good phase 3 information. But please justify your decisions around which studies to include and exclude. Next slide, please. So a couple of documentation tips. Please highlight confidential information. There may be information related to the patient access scheme or the WPAS. So please highlight that to us, and we'll keep that confidential and not put it into public domain on our website. There may also be academic incompetence type information where perhaps the information is due to come out in a journal but is not published yet, and you'd identify that as confidential in the same way. We'd ask you to provide clear and correct references, and to actually provide the, if it's an academic paper, to actually provide a copy of that paper. In other cases, it may be possible if it's a link that can be freely and easily available on the internet, provide an e-link to that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So which comparators to include? So our appraisal is going to be focused on your new treatment versus what it's going to displace in Wales NHS. Now, the pivotal study, we recognise the pivotal study in nearly all cases is not actually going to be against that comparator, but then please provide indirect comparison to the most likely medicine to be displaced. So if there is an indirect comparison, you may need to adjust the results to reflect different baselines of the populations. There'll probably be meta-analysis involved in that indirect comparison. Now, in most cases, the comparators should be licensed, but it may be that it's acceptable for unlicensed comparators to be used, particularly if that reflects real-life usage. So please justify your decisions around which comparators you're including or excluding. Next slide, please. In terms of cost effectiveness models, we nearly always prefer a cost utility analysis in the Form B. And the reason is that it uses all the relevant effects. So clinical endpoints, safety endpoints, patient preference, and so forth. And all the costs are combined in it as well. So the medicine acquisition costs, adverse events, monitoring, administration, etc. So they're all included together in a nice tidy model. And from that we can get out the ISA, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, giving us the cost per quality, which we can then compare against other treatments, perhaps in other conditions and other health interventions. So it's a nice universally accepted approach. So that sort of carries a lot of weight with us, as shown in the picture. Cost minimization may be acceptable, but only under very rare circumstances, and those would be when all effects are shown to be equal. So that's not just the primary endpoint, but also factors such as adverse events and patient preference. And it's very rare for those to be actually proven to be equal. So that makes cost minimization in many cases less preferable than cost utility analysis as an approach. Okay, next slide, please. Make it relevant to NHS Wales and the Welsh population. So in many cases, the studies may be conducted at different global locations, but we want the population to be relevant to Wales. So in terms of ethnicity, age, severity of the condition, etc. Next slide, please. So is a medicine for a subpopulation within the license? The studied population should reflect the full license being appraised, but if trials are only covering a subpopulation, please make that clear to us. And the medicine then can be considered for a restricted recommendation in the population for which there's clear evidence. Thank you. Next slide, please. Is the treatment pathway relative to Wales? So in the model, companies are asked to show how their medicine fits into the treatment pathway used in Wales. So we definitely encourage you to seek advice from Welsh clinicians. Don't necessarily assume that the pathway in Wales, the comparators, the place in treatment are the same as other UK countries. Next slide, please. Is the cost effectiveness model a transparent case? So it should be transparent and robust. The base case that we ask for in the cost effectiveness model should be the most plausible scenario, and obviously not necessarily the one that just happens to give the lowest ISA. Check the results have face validity. Are the modelled life expectations and quality of life of patients with the condition, which may be a serious condition, are they plausible versus other people of the same age in Wales? Next slide, please. So outside the base case, we're asked you to consider alternative scenarios within the cost effectiveness model. Make sure they're realistic. So there could be transparent and obvious limitations within the model. We recognise that the model is a model, and it would be, in all cases, there's assumptions and estimates. But explore the ones that may have big limitations and have a big impact on the ISA ratio. So, for example, if quality of life data were taken from patients with a different condition to the one being treated, have a look at exploring the impact of quality of life variation based on some plausible assumptions, because that's likely to have a big impact on the ISA. Make sure the scenarios and sensitivity analyses are clinically relevant. And also, we're really after, as I was saying, ones that have a big impact. Consider omitting scenarios which have little impact on the base case ISA. Thank you. Next slide, please. Budget analysis. Here at AWTTC, we've done some work comparing estimated budgets with the observed expenditure from Welsh prescribing databases. And we published that actually in Pharmacoeconomics back in 2019. And I think what we found was it's actually really difficult for companies to estimate the budget impact accurately. So we found only about 10 out of 49 medicines were within 40% of the observed expenditure. 16 of those 49, so perhaps about 30%, were within 40 to 100% of the estimate, and about half the medicines were over the projected estimate by about 100%, by more than 100%. Sorry. So what I'm really getting at is you may want to consider sensitivity analysis with quite large variations in your market share, because experience suggests that that may be the case. Another thing I'd encourage is make sure that resource costs and savings that are obtained from the cost effectiveness model are transferred across into the budget impact, because this could be to your advantage. Quite often, when a new medicine's introduced, it does bring savings in resource, perhaps from reduced side effects or reduced time in monitoring the medicine or administration of the medicine. So make sure those are transferred across, because there may be advantages in the budget impact resource estimate. One thing that we ask is, obviously there's quite often there's PASs involved, not just on your medicine, but also on the comparators. So what we do is we ask companies to explore the impact of those by using sensitivity analysis at different percentage points. It's explained within the budget impact instructions, which I'll come on to. But that's the way that we basically estimate that you can provide information about how your medicine compares when there's PASs involved on the comparator medicine. Another thing is, providing your PAS or WPAS has been agreed with my colleagues, then we're going to be using that price in the cost effectiveness and budget impact. So don't bother providing alternative scenarios with the list price. Next slide, please. So this is a slide I think which Steph's already shown, but it's just a screenshot from our website showing the link to the budget impact templates, which you can download, fill in the information, and that'll give us the budget impact. Next slide, please. So this is when you've downloaded the budget impact template. This is the title page, so you can clearly fill in the name of your medicine and the indication. There's also other fields to fill in costs of your medicine as modified by a PAS if it's appropriate, plus the costs of comparator medicines and the number of patients receiving each of those medicines within your budget impact scenario. Next slide, please. What you end up with within the template is basically two summary sheets. One of them is the medicine acquisition costs. So this is basically a breakdown for the first 5 years following introduction of how the medicine would impact the budget in terms of the net cost. So you got the number of patients. The third row down is the number of patients receiving the new medicine. And then what we look at is a total summary of the medicine acquisition costs in a market without the new medicine, so before it's introduced. And then another scenario where the new medicine is introduced and displaces some comparators. We take one of those totals from the other, and we end up with the bottom line where you can see £5,000, for example, in year one. So that's a net medicine acquisition cost of introducing the medicine in the first year. Okay, next slide, please. So the previous slide looked at the medicine acquisition costs. Separate from that, we also look at resource type costs, and these are kept separate from the medicine costs because they're really realized in a different way. But this basically captures aspects such as the administration costs, the adverse event type costs, social services, etc. And these are totals. Each of these totals is obtained in those scenarios where the scenario without the new medicine is subtracted from that with the new medicine. So these are the total impact. The resources are summed in that bottom line at the bottom. So there's a saving in year one of £400, so it's minus £400, and that saving increases with time as more patients adopt the new medicine. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Patient organisations are very important to us, and we ask them for submissions when we appraise medicines because they provide insight into how patients are affected by the condition and how the new medicine may help them. So please, if possible, can you provide details of patient organisations? There's a space to do this in the Form B and Form C, particularly if they're based in Wales, because they're particularly relevant to us. Thank you. Next slide, please. So Steph previously mentioned the CRASR and the CRPAR. So the CRASR is, just recapping, is the company's chance to respond to the draft ASR before it goes to the first committee, the NMG meeting. And this is your chance to correct factual inaccuracies, which we may have made in our ASR report. Also, very important, check that confidential info has been correctly identified, and maybe express differences of opinion about what we've said. Similarly, so the NMG meeting will recommend, will make a recommendation called the preliminary appraisal recommendation, and the CRPAR is your chance to feedback on that when we send it to you, to perhaps give a difference of opinion and perhaps justify an approach that you've taken that's different to what has perhaps been challenged by the NMG committee. Just to recap, send appropriate representatives for clinical and HE aspects to Awmsg, and don't necessarily assume that just because the medicine's got a positive recommendation from NMG that Awmsg won't ask challenging questions. Last slide, please. And that's really just to thank you for your attention, and I believe we've got some questions for you. So if you'd like to rejoin at slido.com, please. So, so here's some questions that hopefully relate to some top tips. So I'm in the same position as Steph. I've given myself a challenge of trying to pronounce unpronounceable words. So you can see the way this is going. So a new medicine, Hollywoodinib, is being appraised for treating people with low baking ability, certainly include me. Beriesinib is being used today for treating patients in Wales. So which of these trials would you be least likely to include in your submission? So first one's a dose-finding study of Hollywoodinib, including the licensed dose. The second one's a randomized phase 3 study of Hollywoodinib versus Lethimib, which is carried out in Europe and the USA. And the third one's a randomized phase 3 study of Hollywoodinib versus Lethimib used to obtain the license for Hollywoodinib. Okay, so I think we've got everybody who's going to answering. Oh, maybe not. Okay, right. Okay, so the correct answer here is the dose-finding study. So the randomized phase 3 study will be the probably the would be of interest, but the study of Hollywoodinib versus Lethimib is the license study, so that will definitely be included. The Beriesinib versus Lethimib study could be used within an indirect comparison, so it's probably not something that you go into detail with in the submission, but would certainly be of interest for us. The dose-finding study would be of least interest, as you've identified. So let's have a look at the next question, please. So in the above example, there's no direct studies of Hollywoodinib versus the comparator of interest, which was Beriesinib. What else would be needed within that submission? So is it a cost minimization analysis of Hollywoodinib versus Beriesinib? Indirect comparison, sorry, I've jumped back to the top one. Indirect comparison of Hollywoodinib versus Beriesinib using meta-analysis? Or is it a cost minimization analysis of Hollywoodinib versus Beriesinib? Okay, so we'll go to the answer. And the answer is indeed indirect comparison of Hollywood-Inib versus Berries-Inib using meta-analysis. At some stage, we'd like to have a cost-utility analysis of Hollywood-Inib versus Berries-Inib, but a cost-utility analysis of Hollywood-Inib versus Lethamib is not something that we want, because that's not the comparator ultimately that's used in Wales. And the cost minimisation is always the lesser preferred of the two. So there we are. Next question, please. So a study has shown Bigorotimib is non-inferior to the comparator Halfpenib for the primary endpoint, which is kicking a rugby ball a long distance. Differences were found in some other endpoints. What would be the best cost-effectiveness model? Is it cost-utility analysis, cost minimization analysis, cost-benefit analysis, or cost-consequence analysis? Okay, so we'll go to the answer. I think we've finalized on that one. Yeah, it is cost utility analysis. Cost minimization analysis is not preferred in this case, because there were some differences in some of the other endpoints, although it was non-inferior for the primary endpoint. So there's not complete equivalence in all effects between the two medicines. So cost utility analysis will be the preferred approach. Cost benefit analysis is it's a different type of cost effectiveness analysis that we don't use within Awmsg, where the benefits and costs are all monetarized and combined. Cost consequence analysis is again another approach where the cost and the benefits are actually listed, but again that's not used. Okay, let's go to the final question then, please. So in your base case budget impact analysis, which aspect of these would you not include? So would it be that you're not including the pass adjusted list price of the medicine, sensitivity analysis exploring different market growth projections, reductions in expenditure required by the patient due to reduced travel to hospital arising from improved treatment, the appropriate cost for the time of nursing staff to administer the medicine and the comparator, or associated costs in managing adverse events for both the medicine and the comparator. Okay, I think we've stopped deciding now. So the answer in this one is actually reductions in expenditure required by the patient due to reduced travel to hospital. So if we go through the other answers, sensitivity analysis exploring different market growth projections, something that could easily be included. We definitely will want the PAS adjusted list price, of the medicine. And it's within the resource considerations, definitely consider the cost in managing adverse events for both the medicine and the comparator. That's completely valid. And the cost for nursing staff to administer the medicine and the comparator could be compared and costed within the models. That's fine. The direct costs incurred by the patient or carer wouldn't be in a base case, because we take the paying viewpoint from that of the NHS, and these are costs incurred by the patient. So they wouldn't be in a base case, but they might be considered as a sensitivity analysis. Thank you. I'm finished.
Oh, Stuart, thank you. A lot in there, everybody. Thank you for your time and attention. Do you know, what did I take away from that? You know, top tips in terms of submissions and getting it right. One is communication. You know, don't mire in a sea of confusion. If there's bits you don't get, if there's things you want to know, get in touch with the team, talk to colleagues. But most important, it's just important you really get clarity on what it is that's needed, so that our transformational medicines can become available to the patients in NHS Wales who really are in need. I've been doing this job for more than 15 years, engaging with HTA agencies across England, Scotland, Wales at least, and this is such an important point. Number two, keep the end game in mind. You know, we're developing a narrative, we're building a story. Why should the NHS be recommending our medicines for use for patients in need? I think there's a clear link to be made between clinical and economic evidence. And ultimately, we're writing a book, we're authors. You know, we're telling a story with a start, a middle, and an end. You know, and if my grandmother, you know, was sitting in the room, I'd want her to be able to follow the story that I'm telling, not necessarily the complex technical detail, but I'd want her to be able to understand the story and see the case that I'm trying to put for my medicine to be recommended. And finally, there's something about honesty and transparency. You know, if you don't have the data, then be upfront and say what you've done to manage the data gaps. You know, if you haven't got if you haven't been collecting EQ5D quality of life data in your trial, for example, then what did you collect and how have you mapped that to EQ5D, for example? You know, what have you done to overcome the limitations in your data set? And use sensitivity analysis to show that when you've made assumptions, what difference does that assumption make to the end game? All these things are important points, but most importantly, I think, is reach out. Don't be in a land of confusion where you're not sure what to do or what you could be doing. Or actually, there is a question from me on that, Steph, probably for you. Now, for those of us who engage with NICE, if we there's usually a discussion about the scope of the appraisal at some point. Now, you said a while back when you were speaking about this, we'll be informed as to the scope of our appraisal. What happens if I, as a manufacturer, don't agree with you on the scope of the appraisal? If I think the comparators ought to be different, or the outcomes, or even the way you define the population, what would you say is the best way to approach that?
Okay, thanks, Steve. That's a very good question, and we do have that because sometimes the evidence can be for a defined population, or the comparator is such that it's for a certain stage in a treatment pathway that is narrower than the licensed indication. So in these situations, there is a lot of back and forth communication just between AWTTC and the company, but also between our clinicians within Wales, and sometimes that can delay our communication with you if we're waiting for a clinical clinical expert to get back to us. But basically, there's a three-way conversation, which is sort of mediated by AWTTC to come up with a solution, or to come up with the best possible route for taking that medicine through HTA, and that will involve, like you've implied, a lot of dialogue to arrive at a position that the company are happy with, and that AWTC feel they can take to the committees. In those situations, the company will need to submit for the population and using the comparators they feel are appropriate based on the advice AWTTC give. Now, AWTTC can only advise on what they think is the right approach, but at the end of the day, it's up to the New Medicines Group and the Wmsg to decide whether they can use the evidence that's been provided to make a recommendation. And should the evidence be restricted, then they can certainly make a restricted recommendation for a subpopulation. And like you've already implied, it is very useful if the company justify their approach at all times, and AWTTC will support that process. So I guess AWTTC support the process. At the end of the day, it's providing NMG and Wmsg with the evidence and the justification that enables them to make a suitable recommendation.
Now that's perfect, Steph, thank you. We do have one question in the chat on the detail, which is from Nicole, and it says this. It says, Form B requires company submission 3 months from the date of marketing authorization. Can we clarify whether that is 3 months from UK marketing authorization or European?
Okay, so that will be from the UK authorization, and that I appreciate things have changed with Brexit now, but it would definitely be applicable to the UK marketing authorization.
Perfect. Super. Well, listen, we're approaching the end, but Helen's got a couple of thoughts on the process. If, as we speak, you still have questions, there's still time to pop them in the question in the chat. Helen, over to you.
Diolch, Steve, and apologies I'm not able to join you via video this morning. And thanks also to Steph and to Stuart for all of today's content. I think it's been a really useful sort of operational overview. And thanks, as you say, for inviting me just to talk a little about the appraisal update and just some things to look out for. So if we move to the slide, it's just the one slide. I'll just talk a little of the things that are just to follow and to be aware of, a lot of which we've already covered, so I'll just touch on those a little. And the first thing, I suppose, is that we've talked a lot about the website, and in that sense we're talking about Wmsg's website, but also of course your first point of contact is with us at AWTTC, and as our role as the secretariat to Wmsg, but we have a diverse role on that as well, which is why there are two websites. But I suppose the first thing to say really is that is changing. We will be merging both those websites. And I know that has been, a source of confusion, in the past, and likely still somewhat. So you will see on our website, on that merged website, a lot of the pages you've seen reflected will look the same. It will be on the same platform as Awmsg, so there won't be too much changing from HTA perspective in terms of the look or the documents for you to find. Just to be aware, I'll be rebranded a little with AWTTC, and on there then we'll have a number of consultations, a lot more initiatives really around engagement, and I think that's the theme of all of these points on this slide, and it's it's what's underpinned all of the presentation this morning, and it's really around that engagement. And we've got initiatives on there for public engagement, certainly for clinical experts and industry alike. There are and there will be more opportunity for consultation and participate in our consultations, and that includes our work programs. And so for those that are familiar with Awmsg's documentation, you may have seen some of the changes in terms of licensing now that we've moved across the MHRA, which is the point that's just been raised. And whilst the processes are still in development with the MHRA, I think it's really key point that dialogue, with industry will be really important, in these coming months. And I really wanted to highlight the collaboration with ourselves, with the MHRA, colleagues at NICE and across Scotland and Northern Ireland. And this includes things such as the MHRA Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway. That's one of the examples. So I'm sure you're also very aware of NICE's commitment to assess all new medicines within 90 days. And of course, because NICE advice applies in Wales, this does impact then on the number of HTA coming through Awmsg. But we're very much here to ensure Wales has a voice and is also working with NICE. We have a formal memorandum of understanding, get my words out, and it's really making sure that there isn't conflicting advice or inequities. And then some of those examples we've talked about today, and one of which Steph raised earlier in her quiz, which is about some of the changes to exclusion criteria. And essentially this means that for a medicine which is on the NICE work programme, this will likely now be excluded. In the past, depending on the length of time between license and the NICE advice to be published, that may not have always been the case. And some of the examples we have on there, the most recent updates to the process, you'll see in the statement of advice review that's on there, and the biosimilar medicines paper, both on the Awmsg website. And these really are ensuring that we are aligned, we're appropriate with NICE and the rest of the UK. And particularly the statement of advice document is looking at reasons behind non-engagement with the industry, talking about all the different steps we've mentioned earlier, Form A stage, Form B stage, and ways in which we can improve that sort of communication and looking at our process. And you would have heard really the last open day about the progress to the Horizon scanning process and updates from the commercial arrangements team, and these are available on the Awmsg website if you are interested, the presentations from the last open day. And I suppose the only other updates really then are to look at the new streamline paediatric process, which Steph has been able to give us some examples today. That's for the paediatric license extensions, and also to the changes to the Awmsg review process for HTA. Both of these will be covered in detail now at the next open day. So I won't go into any more detail for them. I suppose the main take-home message is that engagement is really key, and it's through this that we continue to evolve our processes as a result. So as we move to the next slide, I guess all is really left for me to say is diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Helen, thank you. That's really helpful. As we approach the end, final question, I think, from Helen, which says this. I had heard the timescale for a Wmsg review, if a NICE review is expected, may be coming down to 6 months. So if, for example, a medicine's on the NICE work programme 9 months after launch, would you be expecting to do an Awmsg review or to wait for NICE? That one for you, Steph?
Yeah.
Helen?
Yes, that's fine. Steph, you go ahead.
No, Helen, you answer it. I'm still digesting.
No, that's fine. And that's what the next session will really be about for us, is looking at those processes. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not sort of duplicating that work, not having conflicting advice out there, and that's the reason for the changes to that process, as you say, by increasing what was the timelines, are looking at extending those then going forward.
Okay, that is helpful. And in fact, as we're talking, another question's popped in. Can you clarify, once a product has been approved for reimbursement, if it's available for order through the retail pharmacy vault, whether the PAS price remains confidential? And that's from James.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. That's right. The price will remain confidential. The team that is our commercial arrangements team have their system in Wales set up so that there's only authorised access to that for those that need to know within the health boards, and that is very sort of strictly managed in terms of the confidentiality. So absolutely, any of the PAS that are confidential. All of the details go through there.
Super good. So, team, any last thoughts as we're approaching the end, 20 past 11? Any last thoughts?
No, I think Helen summed up nicely, and I just want to thank Stevie for chairing, and thanks everyone for logging on and remembering to attend. I think the last slide we've got hanging is just a reminder about the next open day, and also to say that ABPI will send an email around, and we really appreciate you completing the feedback survey, just to really help us shape future meetings. That could be anything from the time of day of the meeting to the day of the week to content. Any comments really welcome, because as we move forward to thinking about next year, it would be really useful to find out whether the similar content is useful, or whether anyone has any specific requirements that they think would be useful for their companies or for general interest. So the next session will be another appraisal session on the 8th of July, which is going to creep up quicker than I thought for me. So hopefully you should be able to meet some other members of the team to talk about some of the new processes and Policy. Yeah, so thanks, Steve. I think that's all from me.
Guys, thank you all. Just a final word, HTA requires deep engagement from manufacturers like yourselves. Thank you for joining. Thanks for getting stuck in. If there's things you need to know, or then feel free to reach out at any time. Ask colleagues, make sure you're clear, and thank you for joining. Look forward to seeing you again in a month.
Thank you.